Hello. This presentation was created as a lecture which I gave to Rickmansworth Historical Society on the 13th of May 2021, having been asked by them to give a talk on my collection of postcards at Croxley Green. My collection began with this card almost 30 years ago. It shows some little cottages that used to sit at the top of Scots Hill in front of All Saints Church. I love this card as it's such an evocative image and it leads you to ask questions about it, such as, who are the couples standing by the gate? What would those cottages or Croxley have been like to live in those days? And most importantly, why does it say greetings from Watford on it? I never found answers to these questions, but it got me thinking as to how I should give my presentation. I wondered about giving it in the form of like a general history of Croxley, but figured that because most of my information would have been coming from the fantastic Croxley History website, which is incidentally is where most of these images live these days, that I probably wouldn't be saying anything new to people. So what I've decided to do is turn it into a guided walk around the village, letting the cards themselves tell their story where they can along the way. Who sent them, why, and to whom, that kind of thing. Was the view of relevance to the sender, or was it just the first card that they could lay their hands on? Anyway, I hope you'll join with me on the walk and enjoy the trip. It makes sense to start from Rickmansworth, so we'll approach via Scots Hill, with its old brick bridge marking the start of the steep climb up into Croxley. This card was posted in 1904, when most people would have made the journey on foot. If you met a wagon coming down, as in this view, you'd better move out its way. Scots Hill was the scene of more than one runaway vehicle over the years, with numerous reports in the Watford Observer of a wagon and its contents coming to grief here. I expect the horse and cart driver was taking no chances and had his brake applied all the way down. If the hill was challenging for vehicles going down, it was equally challenging going up too, especially if rain had turned it into a muddy track, as this view from around 1910 shows. Many a cyclist or motor has struggled to get up the hill over the years, as these shots from the 1920s and 1930s illustrate, even with the improved road surface. You wouldn't want to meet something like this coming down if you were struggling to make your way up the hill. It's Sunday the 7th of July 1907 and Scots Hill is on the route of the 5th annual parade of the Rickmansworth and District Friendly Societies. Made up of organisations such as the Ricky Ancient Order of Foresters and the Ricky Oddfellows, the parades were designed to tour the local streets collecting money for various good causes. The Watford Observer reported that these, with their banners, paraded the streets of the town and neighbourhood and made a capital display. And it certainly seems the bigger the banners were, the better. The route started at the Whip and Collar in Mill End, making its way past Ricky Station and up around Croxley, returning to Ricky for a service at St Mary's Church before heading into Batchworth. Collection boxes had been left at pubs and shops en route, and others were carried around by participants, resulting in a total of £36 being raised. Part of that came from the sale of postcards such as these, which had been taken by Ricky photographer Arthur Copping as part of the fundraising campaign. Both these cards were sent to the same person, a lady in Norfolk. She must have known the area, as she was asked in one card which of the faces she recognised, and that three would be very familiar. I wonder if they belong to these girls, who decided to break ranks halfway down the hill and stop and have their picture taken twice. This is the parade 2 years later, in 1909, and it now seems like everyone stopped to have their photo taken. This girl puzzled me for a while. What was she holding? It seems that there was some competition between the children as to who could collect the most amount of money, and this enterprising young lady has ingeniously attached her collection box to a pole to wave under the noses of people watching from upstairs windows as a source of untapped donations. The boys got the downstairs version. She needn't have bothered though, as whilst the children averaged around 10 shillings each, the winner wasn't actually a human but a dog called Corrie Royth, whose box came back with a staggering £1, 3 shillings and sixpence. Arthur Copping again took the photos and managed to raise £1, 3 shillings through the selling of the postcards, no doubt mostly to the grinning faces seen here. The last view I have of the parade is post-war, 1920, and I thought I'd include it as there's some lovely detail in it. It shows that the road hadn't actually been closed off to traffic. I'd imagine the chauffeur of the car trying to get up the hill with the young ladies cursing his luck. She seems absolutely mortified, as she's sunk very low down in her seat. It's unclear if the fire engine was part of the procession or responding to a call, although hopefully it's the former. The walkers in front aren't taking any chances though, and you can see they've left a huge gap between them in case of emergencies. The parade's passed by, and we've managed to get to the top of the hill in one piece. Here we're met with a built-up street, an early hub of the village made up of 18th and 19th century houses, pubs and shops. You can see All Saints' Church in the distance, built in 1872 to turn what had previously been the hamlet of Croxley and part of Ricky Parish into a parish in its own right. This card was posted in September 1914 and shows a very unlucky motorist trying to change his wheel. I wonder if he knew his misfortune was being photographed for posterity. Probably not, as he looks a little distracted by the man standing behind him, most likely a curious local offering terribly helpful advice on how to repair a puncture. Here's the same view, but now in glorious Technicolor. Although it's been printed, so it's not as clear as the photo postcard we just saw, there's still a wealth of information in it. The George and Dragon pub halfway up the road on the left-hand image, the GPO delivery boy with his bicycle outside Benjamin Ward's post office come grocer shop in the right-hand image, and the ever-present piles of manure dotting the road in both. You can tell they were taken after 1907, as that's when the church was extended to create that double roofline that you can see. Both these cards were produced by Joseph Mitchell, who ran a hairdresser's on Scots Hill with a line in fancy stationery, and that's no doubt why he sold these postcards and where they could be bought from. By the time that they had been printed, though, he and his wife had had 10 children, 4 of whom had tragically died young. Mr. Mitchell may have been inspired to publish postcards having seen this one, which had been produced a few years earlier by Ben Ward, and which included his shop on the left. If you look closely in the window, you can see what's probably a selection of his postcards pasted to the glass. The card was sent in 1905, in the heyday of picture postcard collecting, and you can see why he decided to jump on the bandwagon to produce his own. Not only was this a pretty view of the heart of the village, it was also a lesson in self-promotion, with his business standing grandly at the front. Someone familiar with the view would have been Sarah Gurney, who worshipped at the Gospel Hall opposite. The hall had been open for just over a decade when she sent this card of it to her niece in Hatfield in 1907. Sarah wasn't local, but lived in Northwood, where she worked as a servant, making her trip to church here pretty much an all-day affair. A sign on the left-hand wall tells us that preaching took place on Sunday mornings and evenings, with a children's school that afternoon, and with more preaching on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I wonder how many of these Sarah attended. No doubt this card was also meant as a self-promotion piece, as the publishers prettified it by carefully painting out the clutter of its neighbours' gardens and outhouses to either side. Like now, there were all sorts of shops within this small part of Croxley 100 years ago. This image shows what was available just a few years prior to World War I. Edwin Grimes, the draper, could only have been there for about a year or so, as the business doesn't crop up much locally. Maybe it was the name that put people off buying their nice white shirts and collars from him. We do know a little more about Kemp's motor and cycle repair shop next door, though. Walter Kemp and Sons had taken over the business in 1905. They didn't live in Croxley, but along Whippendale Road in Watford. However, one of their employees, William Beecham, and his wife Ada lived above the shop, which you can see was absolutely plastered with enamel signs advertising Pratt's Motor Spirits, Sturmey Archer hub gears, and Roger Whitworth cycles, amongst others. You can see Berean cottages behind, the ones in our first postcard, which had been built in 1827 as almshouses for the village elders. Even with the relative lack of traffic in around 1910, the occasionally furious-driven wagon would have meant the spot chosen by those boys to sit couldn't have been very sensible, and no doubt they would have been in trouble with their parents had any of them seen them in this card after it was published. Moving on to just after World War I, and both businesses have now gone, to be replaced with Henry and Alice Windows Boot Repairs and Drapers, and John and Eva Trott's Croxley Green Dairy with refreshment room at the front. Winnie Window's shop remained here for many years, until the 40s, and may still be remembered by some of Croxley's older residents. If you were having a cup of tea next door at the Trotts, you'd know that the milk in it would be fresh. There were milking sheds at the back of the premises, and cows were often seen being driven here from the local farms via the green and through the passageway on the left of the photo. This is one of a number of cards of Croxley that was produced by Arthur Darrah of Rickmansworth, a photographer who sold an extensive range of local views in the decades following World War I. As with this one, they're usually lovely crisp images, and they show an absolute wealth of information. Now that we've done our shopping, we'll turn left and pass by All Saints Church. It was a really popular subject, as most of my Croxley cards actually include it somewhere in them. We're not going to linger too long at the church, but I've picked out a few cards that I'd like to chat to you a little bit more about. Although it's not postmarked, this card must have been sent in July 1907, as it describes the great storm that swept the region that year. Sent to a Mr. and Mrs. Wookey of Hastings, it says, "They had an awful storm at Watford. The station got flooded out. We had to have a lot of changing. Had to go to Brighton and change there." All Saints Church was extended at the end of that year, doubling its size, as is shown in this view. This card was posted in September 1915 by B.M. to her friend, a Miss Robertson of Harrow. It starts off with a very grand "Dear Madam," and goes on to invite her and Miss Lizzie over the following weekend, where she would take them to Moor Park, where the soldiers dig trenches, and on the lake, there we will have tea on the houseboat. This colorised card was sent in 1909 to 7-year-old Alfred Timberlake at the Children's Hertfordshire Convalescent Home, St Leonards-on-Sea, Sussex, from his parents who lived at 215 New Road, Croxley. The seaside retreat had been opened around 20 years earlier to provide convalescence for the poor of the country, both adults and children. His parents had presumably picked a local view to remind young Alfred of home while he was recovering so many miles away. In their message, they gently chastised him for not having written to them sooner. Hopefully this encouraged him. Anyway, Alfred recovered and went on to live a long life in Croxley until his death 80 years later. The church doors are open, so we'll quickly poke our head inside and take a look around before moving on. The extension would have been brand new when these photos were taken and was perhaps the reason why they were produced. The right-hand card was sent by Jim to his aunt, a Miss Horn of Leighton Buzzard. Elizabeth Horn was a widow when she received this card in 1910. Jim, or James Edmonds, was the son of her elder brother. He was writing to let his aunt know that he and his family had made it back safely to their home in Watford after visiting her. He was 17 and looking for a job. He explained that, "I got 1 week or so of work left, but if you should hear of anything, don't forget me." Within a few months, he had actually found employment as a butcher, but by the 1930s had moved on to become a foreman on the LMS railway. Coming out the other side of the church, and we come across local butcher Frederick Jackson on his rounds with his delivery cart. Jackson had a shop at 175 New Road for many years, from around 1900 to the 1930s. In 1913, the year this card was sent, Jackson proudly advertised that families were waited upon daily, presumably what this postcard's illustrating, and that all his meat was slaughtered on the premises by the RSPCA Humane Killer. The card was sent by E of 10 Cherry Cottages, one of the terraced houses that still sits at the top of Scott's Hill. E may have been Elizabeth Jeffrey, who had been living there 2 years earlier. Her husband, Herbert, coincidentally worked in a butcher shop. Hopefully, this shop was Jackson's, or his wife would have been advertising the competition for him. We're now going to make our way up the green, which, if you believe all these picture postcard views, was always awash with children having picnics. The top left card was produced by Lillywhite, a company in Halifax that produced cards of all over Britain, rather like Francis Frith. They produced several views of the village in around 1920. The bottom right card was printed more locally. It was sent on the 1st of August 1918 by George, a soldier who had just arrived home on leave for 10 days from hospital. Unfortunately, nothing more is known about George, other than he was planning to spend much of his time with Florrie. We do know a little more about the sender of this card, though, as they very helpfully wrote their address on it, 283 New Road, Croxley. Posted in 1909, it reads, "Dear A, Just a card. You see we've moved in at last and getting quite settled. Nearly got all straight. Think we shall like it. We all seem better and eat and sleep well so far. C&J had very good nights up to now. We've just been to Watford on the motor bus and got my new curtains for front room. You wouldn't know the house now when you come to see us again. It closes with the enigmatic lines. So sorry about your mess. Try cleaning it with petrol. This would be the Clulu family, who were living here in 1911. Father Bertie was a telegraph linesman for the GPO, who'd just moved in with his wife Clara and young children from Ricky. Their two infants, Charles and Jessie, were the C&J mentioned as starting to sleep well. Sadly, Jessie didn't make it to adulthood, dying just a few years later. I love the background detail of this card. I've seen many views of the top of Scott's Hill, looking from the hill towards the church, but this is the only one I've seen with any great detail looking in the other direction. It's great to find a different perspective of a familiar view. Here's another view where the devil's in the detail. There doesn't appear to be much going on in this card that was posted in 1922, until you zoom in and you can see there's an absolute hive of activity. Is that young girl trying to chase the motor car on roller skates? I'll leave you to decide. As we're wandering up the green, it would be nice to stop off briefly and chat to some of the residents living along it. The 16th century Providence Hall, occupied by Reuben Doggett, the wheelwright. Tweedside, between All Saints Church and New Road. This was sent in 1912 as a Christmas card by Mr. and Mrs. Walter Aitchison Carr, who had just moved into this newly built house. Walter came from Berwick, which is presumably why he named it Tweedside, and remained here until his death in 1958. He saw service in the Boer War, the First World War, and was chief ARP warden during World War II. He also found time to establish the hardware business, W.A. Carr and Sons Limited, which still trades along New Road. Between Tweedside and Providence Hall is Sundial's cottage, shown in this card. It was actually just by chance that we were even able to identify this place as being in Croxley. There wasn't a caption on the front to identify it. It was printed in Gateshead and written to someone in Aylesbury and about someone connected with Cornwall. Luckily, the sender had the foresight to write Croxley Green on the back, which was a good start, and from there we could work out who sent it. The elderly gent standing by the gate is probably a George Gurney, a retired bookmaker who lived at Sundials, then known as the Laurels, when this card was sent in 1910, and he almost certainly wrote the card as the handwriting conforms with his entry on the 1911 census. Known in the business as Captain Shortodds, he built up such a good reputation that he had his own personal pitch at many of the top racecourses, including Newmarket, and when travelling to London could get the express train to stop for him at Ricky Station to board. At his destination, he was met by his minder, usually an ex-champion boxer, who would escort him to his office. At home, Joey, as he was known locally, was very fond of horses and kept some in the paddock behind his house. Never marrying, he was apparently very generous, although whether this was financially is debatable, as he often boasted that he could survive on sixpence a day, and legend has it that he kept his money hidden in a coffin so no one would steal it. He retired in 1907, but kept up his sporting passion of attending the old Berkeley Hunt, mainly around the Vale of Aylesbury, which may be how he got to meet Mrs., later Lady Duffy, the wife of Sir John Duffy, a Scottish barrister, to whom this card was sent. It wasn't just private houses that took the photographer's attention, with one or two veering, in more ways than one, towards the public houses too, as they made their way up the green. Here's a typical one, the Artichoke, with the blacksmiths next door. As mentioned before, everyone was trying to cash in on the postcard craze, and the Robinsons who ran the Artichoke were no exception. They'd run the pub for many years, long enough to have their name painted on the sign, which also showed that they were supplied by Bass. This is a curious card, as it's actually a printer's sample. Listed on the back is a price guide from the London Studio Postcard Company for the cost of turning photographs provided by customers into printed postcards. Although it's been scribbled out, you can still make out that it would cost you 9 shillings and 4pence for 100 cards, up to £4 10 shillings for 6,000. I wonder how many cards the Robinsons thought they'd be able to sell of their pub. A feature of the 17th century artichoke was the old stunted tree which stood outside for many years. No doubt many hundreds of backsides have perched on the bench that encircled it after a long day in the fields or at Dickinson's paper mill. The wooden lattice porch on the right was removed sometime around the First World War when bay windows were added downstairs. As well as a pint of Bass, you could also enjoy some local cherries while sitting here. On this card from 1903 is scribbled, "Do your Kent cherry trees equal these?" The reverse says, "Although the trees are not so high as the spire of St. Paul's, yet I assure you the height of the Hart's cherry is without parallel." The country around here abounded with cherry orchards and gardens, and Croxley had its fair share of them. There must have been a thriving cherry industry here for many years, as the trees are ancient even as far back as 1900, when the Sporting Gazette described a walk up "the sunburnt green of Croxley, with its magnificent cherry orchards on both sides, great gnarled giants that belie their gentle occupation of growing fruit." With a view taken from just outside the pub, it's nice to think that Sender had been writing it while sitting outside, tucking into some of Croxley's famous crop. The most well-known Croxley orchard was Stone's, across the road and up the green from the Artichoke. The orchard had been very popular with locals, especially in the early summer when the crop could be picked. Families would make special trips along the green on what became known as Cherry Sunday to purchase a basket of juicy ripe cherries, after which they could stretch out on the grass and have a cherry picnic. This view of the Artichoke includes on the far right an X, denoting the sender's home. The card reads, "We've been very busy over the Boy Scouts concert. Lillian wrote the play for them, and we've had to have all the rehearsals here. Love from us both, M. G. Kernan." The house marked is Fernley House, and it can also be seen on this postcard from around 1920. In 1914, the year this postcard was sent, it was occupied by Mabel Georgina Kernan and her daughter Lillian. Mabel had been born and raised in India, being the daughter of a colonel in the army there. In 1888, she married a surgeon in the Indian Medical Service, giving birth to Lillian the following year. Her husband died of influenza just a year after that, after which Mabel and Lillian moved to England, and by 1901 were living in Ricky High Street. When this card was sent, in February 1914, Mabel was 47 and had just moved into the house in Croxley. The Scouting movement had only been around for about 5 years, since 1909, when Robert Baden-Powell first published Scouting for Boys. Croxley established a troop very early on, led by Scoutmaster Mr. Pitkin. Lillian must have decided to become involved and allowed them to use the stables behind the house, possibly for meetings, as well as the concert rehearsals. Within months of the card being sent, though, many of the Scouts and Scoutmasters would have left the movement to join the war effort. Lillian stepped up to the mark and became the Croxley Scoutmaster, and in 1915 started a wolf pack for younger boys to meet at the Fernley Villa stables. Numbers were small though, so any boy wishing to progress to Scouts usually ended up joining the Ricky troop, which Lillian also became temporary Scoutmaster of. The Kernans didn't live in Croxley for long. By 1920, they'd moved back to Ricky, where Mabel died in 1926. Remaining a spinster, Lillian died there too, just 3 years later. We'd better continue our walk up the green. Here's a timeless view of it, probably relatively unchanged for centuries. Time-worn tracks across the common, sheep grazing, the outline of a cottage roof from behind a rambling hedge. However, just 100 yards further north, the newly constructed Copthorne Road, and with it Copthorne House, reminds us that time never stands still. Plots were being sold off for development throughout the first decade of the 20th century. When this postcard was produced, in around 1905, Copthorne House was still really the only property at this end of the newly constructed road. You can just make out the fence in the distance on the left, after which the road continued across fields until it joined up with Scots Hill. Here's another similarly dated development, built just south of Copthorne Road on the site of the Coach and Horses former orchard, probably taken in the 1920s. When looking at the detail of this card, I was wondering what was going on in the distance on the left-hand side, as there looked to be a flurry of activity. As the view was just a snapshot of a single moment 100 years ago, I assumed I'd never find out. However, in going through my other cards, I saw I had another Darrow of the Green that was 3 numbers up in the sequence, so it may have been taken on the same day. Lo and behold, there's a group of workmen digging in the road outside the Coach and Horses, even the truck's in the same place. Maybe they saw Darrow take the other photo and felt a photo opportunity was called for. Reaching the north end of the green, we could stop briefly to watch the cricket, which was played here during the summer holidays, watched over by Croxley House. The close-up view of the house on the top right, erroneously labelled as the Manor House, was posted on a cold January morning in 1914, soon after the sender had joined the staff of the Woolwich family who lived there. "You see I have arrived here quite safely. I thought perhaps you might like this postcard of our house. It is very pleasant, especially in the summer time. However, it's awfully cold here at present." Wandering briefly to the right of the house, we come to Little Green and Waterdale House, seen in the central card, which was sent in 1907 by FAS to Lance Corporal A.E. Barker of the 1st Norfolk Regiment. FAS was living at Waterdale House and was apparently very pleased with her new residence, writing, "This is just a glimpse of our house. It's not a nice view, as there isn't enough of our house to make it nice. This is my afternoon off. I'm just going to Rickmansworth, so I'll post you this." The recipient, Albert Edward Barker, was a career soldier, having served in South Africa 5 years before receiving this card. By 1907, he was about 29 and based at Worley Barracks near Brentwood in Essex. FAS was 20-year-old Frances Alice Stanford, a Norfolk girl who went on to marry Albert 3 years later. No doubt she was one of the 3 maids employed by the Ormerod family who lived there. Once married, Frances left Croxley to join him as an army wife, until World War I intervened and he was sent off to fight on the Western Front. Sadly, he was killed there in June 1918. A widow at 31, Frances returned to Norfolk, where she lived, never remarrying, until her death in 1966. Still at the top end of the green, we're now 1 year into the Great War, and a group of soldiers has stopped to have their photo taken. They're from a battalion of the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment, also known as the Sherwood Foresters, who were billeted in Casbury Park between August 1915 and April 1916. From the flags and pocket mirror they're carrying, they're probably signallers. The card states, "This photo was taken on Croxley Green after we'd been out for 2 days and nights." I'm not sure what they were doing in Croxley, as the battalion war diaries don't mention the village by name. They may have been just passing through, as they frequently marched down to Moor Park, where Lord Ebury let them carry out exercises. One of their challenges was to dig trenches in the park, of specific dimensions, in a set time, in full kit, at night, and with no artificial light to help them. Quite an undertaking, their CO no doubt thought. However, being from a coal mining region of the Midlands, most of these soldiers were ex-miners, and so easily managed it, in a third of the allotted time. Interestingly, this would have been the trench building that BM told Dear Madam about in her postcard from September 1915. I wonder what happened to these men after the photo was taken. They left Castlebury for Dublin in Ireland to help suppress the Easter Uprising before being sent to the Western Front in early 1917. Hopefully they made it through the war. Apparently, though, Watford had proved very popular with the Sherwood Foresters, and many of them returned after the war to marry local girls, so maybe some of these have local descendants. Before we leave the green, we'll just take a look back to see some of the other cards of it. Instead of following the lane to Sarratt, we can join the other fashionable Edwardians and continue straight on at the rear of Croxley House, along the field path and into Harrock's Wood. The track emerges at Chandler's Cross, but not before it plunges into an impressive avenue of beech trees known as Finch's Avenue. This must have been a favourite destination, as so many cards were produced of it that I've actually had to stop collecting them. The Sporting Gazette for 1900 called it "one of the sights of Hertfordshire, a wonderful and impressive gathering of beech trees doming 100 feet above our heads in gentle green, an avenue formed by nature and stretching straight ahead till the other entrance appears but a tiny hole. The lofty roof of leaves gives the impression of a cathedral made without hands, and the reverent feeling of being in church comes over us." Similar virtues were given in a 1906 edition of the Shoreditch Observer, in an attempt to get Londoners out of the grime of the city and into the countryside. Our walks led us out of Croxley and into Chandler's Cross. If we turn right here, we can head back into the parish via Railsbarn Lane. This ancient byway separates Croxley from Castlebury Park and may have been named after Henry Rouse, a 16th century property owner. Rouse may have owned Rousebarn Farm, seen here, which has stood at the junction of Rousebarn Lane and Little Green Lane since at least the mid-1700s, when it was the only property along here. Formerly a small farm of 54 acres, by the time this card was sent in 1911, the building and its land formed part of the Durrants estate, although it's not strictly speaking in Croxley parish at all, but Watford. It was tenanted by Thomas Tompkins and his wife Susan. He was a farm bailiff, managing the other tenant farmers on the Durrants estate, and she was a dairy and poultry maid. Their work was no doubt limited by 1911, though, as both were well into their 70s. The card has the appearance of being a one-off, so who sent it, and why was the view of significance to them? A little research suggests that the sender, L, was Thomas's niece Lillian, who lived in Watford. Lillian worked as a photographic plate cutter at the Paget Prize Plate Photographic Company, who also produced postcards, so this may have been one of her own personal creations. The Tompkins only lived another 5 years at the farm. Susan died in 1916 and Thomas subsequently moved away. It was taken over by Mr. Alexander, the new bailiff. He must have been a bachelor, as he immediately placed an advert in the paper for someone to fill Susan's role, with the words, "Wanted, a respectable, middle-aged widow as housekeeper of a small farmhouse. Must understand poultry." Quite a specific set of requirements. Carrying on up the lane and over the ridge of Jacket's Hill, we soon approached the bridge over the Grand Union Canal, taking us to the watercress beds on the other side. The right-hand card of the bridge, as we look back having crossed, shows open ground to the left, what would become Gade Bank with its 1920s houses, built for employees of the newly built railway line. Rousebarn Lane eventually leads out onto the Rickmansworth Road at Cassia Bridge Farm in Watford. We'll turn right here onto Cassia Bridge and back into Croxley. This is Cassia Bridge, showing the beer house known as the Halfway House, which was sandwiched between the humpback bridges over the Gade and the canal, a view almost unrecognisable when comparing it to today's flat concrete bridge dual carriageway. Being on Cassia Bridge Wharf, the beer house had been providing refreshment to both road and river folk since at least 1861, with a steady stream of workers on tap from both the wharf and the nearby Dickinson's Mill. It even had its own bus stop. The bottom left photo shows the area wasn't just popular with adults, as it seems to have been a good spot for catching minnows too. The top card was posted in 1908, when the Colebrook family ran the Halfway House. I've always loved the rural nature of this view. Unfortunately, it was produced by Alfred Warren of Vicarage Road, Watford, whose cards tend to fade more than most. It was sent to Frederick Walker, a signaller in the 2nd Norfolk Territorial Regiment, by his cousin who lived on Gladstone Road, Watford. Fred, being just days away from sailing to the East Indies with his regiment, was justifiably apprehensive, and so his cousin was ordering him to "cheer up, write to me before you go, and every time you stop on the way, and do not forget." The scene includes the wharf house on the left, by the driveway that carried on down to the main entrance to Dickinson's paper mill. The dray that can be seen is returning to Watford with empty barrels from the pub. Many years later, one of the pub's last residents, prior to its demolition, remembered night times frequently disturbed by the eerie clattering of a horse and cart turning in towards the wharf. One night, he and his wife decided to see what was making the noise, but there was nothing there. I guess by then the pub had moved on from beer to spirits too. Instead of taking the road back to the village, we're going to head along the canal towpath to Croxley Mill Cottages, which sat on a narrow finger of land between the canal and River Gade, on the road to Dickinson's Mill. There were 8 cottages in total here, in 2 terraces. Each had 4 rooms and came with their own garden. They must have been built around the same time as the mill, in 1829, and were rented out to employees, with some of them living here a considerable time. In researching these cottages, I was contacted by a lady whose family had been tenants of one for over 70 years. Another branch of her family lived in one of the other cottages. They got to know each other, fell in love, and the rest is history. She remembers going down to the site as a youngster in the 1960s. The cottages had long gone by then, but the gardens, with their lawns and fruit trees, remained. The perfect spot, she said, for fishing and a picnic. Carrying on down the towpath, we come to Dickinson's Mill. It's the 23rd of May 1924, and last night a fire broke out there, the flames of which could be seen for miles around. The mill's own fire team were unable to put it out and so sent a call out for help. This resulted in a total of 12 fire brigades attending the scene, including one from Chesham, which made the 11.5-mile journey in an hour. It took 4 hours and 100 firefighters to control the blaze, and the aftermath can be seen here, which shows the offices and stationery department completely gutted. Miraculously, though, none of the manufacturing areas and almost no machinery was damaged, and so work was able to continue unabated the following day. Crossing back over the canal from the smouldering mill and climbing Mill Lane, we come out onto Watford Road at the Red House. This photo was taken in around 1910 and includes New Road to the right of the pub, which had been developed primarily for the mill workers. When you think that dozens of these would have had to walk past this junction every day on their way home, you can see why it was the perfect spot to establish a pub. Being 15 years before the construction of Croxley Met Station, which would be built to the photographer's right, the pub was also where the London and North Western Railway omnibus stopped on its shuttle to the nearest station. You can see its timetable at the base of the flagpole. You can also make out a bell sign advertising that the pub was connected to the National Telephone Service, to entice potential customers through its doors, bearing in mind that very few residents in those days would have had a telephone themselves. The children posing in what would be an incredibly dangerous place to loiter now would have been looking across Watford Road and into open fields, the closest of which was owned by Dickinson's. It was used as the village sports pitch and came with its own pavilion. This is most likely where this photo of Croxley's football team for the 1911-12 season was taken. Croxley had two teams in the league, Croxley Green and Croxley North End. The former was also in the Chesham League, and the silverware here may include the Chesham Charity Cup, which they won in a 2-1 victory against Northchurch on the 27th of April 1912. As an aside, the local football association had decreed that matches played that week could raise money for the Titanic Disaster Fund, as the ship had sunk just 12 days earlier. By the time this photo was taken, in 1926, Dickinson's sports pitch had been moved to its current site off the green, as the old site had been destroyed when the Met Line had cut through it. The Red House is now on the left, with Croxley Met Station, only opened a year before, straight ahead. Watford Road still appears to be a country lane, however, work is afoot to change this. If you look at the top right corner, you'll see workmen finishing constructing what will become the parade of shops. The hedges will soon be torn away, as will the ones on the left when they're replaced with housing within a few years, to create the suburban view that we know today. Instead of going back directly via Watford Road, we're going to take a detour along New Road, which, by the early 20th century, was the most populated one in Croxley. Many of the earliest postcard views of Croxley were published by Watford photographer Frederick Downer from around 1905, which is roughly when the top left card dates from. New Road was only around 40 years old at the time, having been carved out of the fields belonging to Hollow Tree Farm on the Green back in the 1860s, when it was known as Croxley Green Road, and so had quite a new look to it in these early views. The road in the foreground's changed considerably. Dickinson's Institute on the left and the block of buildings on the right have gone. Other than that, the scene is pretty much that of today, apart from the lack of cars and tarmac, that is, and obviously the prerequisite gaggle of children is also present. The Institute opened in 1895 as a working man's club for the mill workers living there. By 1905 it had proved so popular that it had to be extended, and this is what the card on the top right shows. Although the card on the bottom right predates the extension, the building work was complete by the time it was sent in the May of that year. The recipient must have been familiar with the place, as the sender wrote, "Thought you would like to see this. Now finished." It's unclear what association the recipient had with the Institute, as he was a wooden hoop merchant from the East End of London and living in Brighton. Whilst lots of cards exist of the outside of the building, this is the only one I've seen actually showing the inside. Although it was never used, there's lots of information written on the front to say what it's of. It shows the 13th annual exhibition of local industries, held at the Institute on the 13th and the 15th of June 1908. One display, by the Watford Engraving Company, demonstrated how postcards were created by carrying out the whole process on site, this card being one of those that was actually produced there on the day. Although the stands are occupied by the professional manufacturers, the exhibition also sought to bring out local amateur talent, with displays covering a range of activities, including carpentry, needlework and cookery. There were also fun competitions staged on the day to find quite unique skills, such as pencil sharpening for women, hat trimming for men, and boot polishing for boys. One of the groups demonstrating their skills was the Croxley Green Church Lads Brigade, who had used the Institute as their drill hall since they were reformed in 1900. The card was published prior to 1910 and shows some of the younger boys lining up outside, possibly for an Empire Day parade. They're wearing what looks like their Sunday besters uniforms, because they're all quite different, and many have rifles with them, which were often fitted up for bayonet practice. A thought that's quite chilling when you think that most of these boys would actually see action in World War I within the decade, with many joining the King's Royal Rifle Corps. Facing the camera on the right with a moustache is Sergeant Instructor Thomas Denton, a mill worker who lived in Dickinson Square behind the Institute. This is the Dickinson Square that he would have known, where many of his co-workers lived. 20 years earlier, it would have just been a field of crops, known as Milestone Field. The scene hasn't changed much since, although the trees are much bigger and the roads are now clogged with cars. Curiously though, maps from around this period show a bandstand here, but it never actually appears on these early photographs. Denton and his neighbours would have used their local shop, the Co-op, which at the time was not much more than a house when it opened here in 1904. Although the left-hand card isn't dated, the Co-op is very conveniently advertising the film The Two Little Waifs in its window, which was appearing at the local cinema, and dates it to 1910. The goods displayed outside this little shop, from the advertised hot drinks and boot polish to the garden spades lined up against the wall, just hint at the array of treasures that must have filled its insides. If you couldn't find what you needed, though, you could always pop across the road to Dimmock's grocery store on the right to see what goodies they had. Presumably, the left-hand view was taken during the school day, as the road's almost completely empty, as opposed to the masses that have assembled for the lily-white card on the right, taken a decade later. Moving up New Road back towards the Green, and we can identify the sender of this card. It was posted in 1906 by L.G., who'd just moved into their new home in New Road, which they conveniently marked with an X. This looks like number 117, which was occupied around that time by the Grace family, with head of household Lewis Grace, L.G., running a confectionery shop there. Although they'd only taken up residence there recently, the Graces had lived in Croxley for some time, with Lewis being heavily involved with local groups such as the Dickinson's Choir and the Church Lads Brigade. The business in New Road wasn't to last though. His daughter died a year into their tenancy, and by 1911 he worked as a cook at Dickinson's Mill. The family appear to have left Croxley by 1914. This stretch of New Road was popular with the postcard manufacturers, presumably as there were so many houses to be seen, they could assume that a proportion of the residents, many of whom wouldn't own a camera of their own, would want to purchase a copy. The other two cards date to around 1914. The one at the bottom was sent by a Kitty, writing from Chestside, Copthorne Road. The Oddie family lived there at the time, with Mr. Samuel Ingleby Oddie being one of central London's leading coroners. There wasn't a Kitty in the family, so she must have been either the cook, the parlour maid, or the scullery maid that they employed at this time. From here we're going to turn left into York Road, another surprising location for the postcard publishers. Laid out at the same time as New Road, it was originally known as Garden Road, although there were only a couple of houses on it until the late 19th century. The bottom left card was posted in 1913, whilst the bottom right one was posted the following year, 2 days after the start of World War I. The gate on the right would take you onto a footpath leading through an orchard into Dickinson Avenue. This card was sent by a resident of York Road to a Miss Sims of 3 Clarence Square, Cheltenham. A little digging revealed that, in 1909, a Walter Richard Sims of that address married a Martha Quelch, of York Road, Croxley, so there's the connection. The couple moved to Harrow, where they had 2 daughters, before Martha and the girls returned to Croxley at the outbreak of war when Walter enlisted. He joined the 3rd London Yeomanry, serving in Gallipoli, Greece and Egypt. He survived the war but was invalided out after the armistice, tragically to die only 4 years later. At the far end of York Road, we come out once again onto Watford Road, close to the Duke of York Beer House, which is the subject of this 1908 Christmas card by Annie, and posted to a Mr. and Mrs. Charlesworth of Manchester on the 24th of December. Either Annie was confident the postal service was quicker than it is now, or she had forgotten to get it into the post on time. Anyone who remembers the Duke of York will recall the date 1897 under the gables at the front. This was when the single-storey tea room was added on the left-hand side, a venture which they were still promoting in this image, judging by the amount of tea signs that there are plastered to the front. Another venture was the welcoming of cyclists. Prior to the First World War, cycling was still a very popular pastime, and many clubs and individuals would use Watford Road as a means of moving about, as it had a relatively good surface, being one of the old turnpike roads. The every accommodation for cyclists, dinners, teas and beds sign on the left-hand side under the pub sign would have been a beacon for the weary pedlar. If your transport had 4 legs instead of 2 wheels, though, the wooden trough on the right would hopefully have provided sufficient refreshment. I'm unsure who the group are in the photograph, or if Annie's amongst them. I'm assuming she is, as it's such a personal image that it would have been of relevance to either her or the Charlesworths. It's almost certainly a pose shot, though, probably of the pub staff, as the ladies look like they've just come out of the beer house for it to be taken and are completely unprepared for what appears to be a cold day. The following year, 1909, June the 14th to be precise, and King Edward VII and Queen Alexandria were on their way from Hatfield House to Windsor Castle, on a route that took them through Croxley and Rickmansworth. The Duke of York became the perfect spot for the children of the adjacent York Road and Old Boys' schools to assemble and wave as they drove by. This card, Waiting for the King, shows the younger children all lined up in their Sunday best. It was written by Hubert Miller. The only local man I could find with that name was a 25-year-old seller of sports equipment who lived along Market Street in Watford. He was also manager of Watford Amateur Football Club, as well as a volunteer in the Hertfordshire Yeomanry. He enlisted as a full-time soldier with them at the commencement of war and was sent to Gallipoli, being killed there in September 1915. This card, The King at Croxley, was taken moments later and shows the royal car driving past. It reads, "Very glad to hear of your success. I suppose it means college in September. I'm very busy. CS on the 19th of this month. Hope you do well on Friday. Yours in haste, A.D." A postscript added, "This is the way we play at school, taken last week. I'm feeling quite well, although I look a little mad." Written by an adult. Can you spot the most likely sender? A.D. is probably EastEnder Annie Dobson, a 35-year-old teacher who'd recently relocated to Croxley and was teaching at the Old Boys' School. She lived in a 2-room apartment along New Road, which she shared with her stepsister. Presumably written to an ex-student of Miss Dobson's, I wonder what the CS was that was keeping her busy. We're now returning to Ricky, taking one last look at the Duke of York and York Road School, with a view taken in the mid to late 1920s. Again, Watford Road's being built on, and houses have appeared where, a decade earlier, there would have just been fields and hedges. There's one plot left, though, with a sign just visible on it, which is probably advertising a new residential road about to be constructed here, what is now Bateman Road. Our last card by Alfred Darrah. You can see his bicycle propped up against the telegraph pole on the right. Turning around, we're going to take the next left before the church into All Saints Lane and Croxley Hall Woods, so we can return to Ricky whilst avoiding Scots Hill steep gradient. Now, a quiet trackway through ancient woodland. In antiquity it would have been a busy thoroughfare, linking the inhabitants of Croxley with the lord of their manor, whose house is believed to have sat at the end of it, at what is now Croxley Hall Farm. Even during the early 20th century, when our postcard walk is set, it would have been a fairly busy place, as it formed one of the access roads to the Rickmansworth Sand and Gravel Company's gravel pits, which had recently started operating there. The entrance to one of these would have been directly behind the photographer when capturing the image of Croxley Hall Farm in around 1920. I'll leave you with the right-hand card and an enigma. Why would Arthur Shaw from Manchester send a Christmas card of Croxley Hall Wood to Harold Murray of Southall in London? That's a research question for another day, although if anyone has any suggestions, answers on a postcard please. We'll conclude our walk by taking Lavrock Lane to the west to emerge from the woods at the bottom of Scott's Hill, hopefully on a day when the parade's not in town. And so ends our tour. I hope you enjoyed it and you're not too worn out. My thanks go to Margaret Pomfret and the team who put together the wonderful Croxley History website, as well as everyone else who helped me with my research, so I could talk to you about my postcards today. Thank you.